Visa has never given out a loan. Not one. Not ever. It has never approved a credit application, never chased a late payment, never absorbed a single dollar of default. And still, it keeps 83 cents. And that is true of every single dollar. 83%. That is the number that matters. In North America, that number is real. It isn't a guess. It isn't a leak from inside a boardroom. It's sitting inside a federal lawsuit. The United States government wrote it down. 83% North American operating margin, cited in US Department of Justice antitrust complaint 2024. Higher than Apple, higher than almost anyone, higher than Google. It is sitting in plain sight, higher than almost any large company on earth. Earned without lending a single dollar, without holding a single risk. Zero risk, maximum reward. How is that even possible? The answer is in your wallet right now. It has been your entire life. You think you don't pay Visa. You're wrong. Every swipe you make carries a hidden fee. Every tap, every contactless transaction, every time a card number is entered into a checkout form. And somewhere inside that fee, money moves. But it doesn't move where you'd expect. The cash paying customer funds it. The basic debit card holder funds it. But they don't receive the reward. Someone else gets the free flight. Someone else gets the hotel suite and the upgrade and the points that never expire. You're paying for a stranger's vacation every time you buy groceries, and you have never once been told, this machine wasn't built by a banker. It was built by a man who hated banks, who openly despised hierarchy. He swore no one entity would ever control it, who modeled his network on the behavior of bird flocks rather than the policies of corporate governance. Today, one company controls 60% of US debit transactions, 83% margin, a market capitalization north of $600 billion. And right now, the Department of Justice is standing in a federal courtroom trying to tear a piece of it apart. Even its own founder eventually called it a monster. So what happens next? Who wins when the toll booth finally gets challenged? And is there any mechanism on earth, legislative, competitive, or technological, that can actually change what you pay at the register? This machine is working while we sleep. Strategy Lens exists to do one thing: pull back the curtain on the companies that quietly run your financial life. Every documentary on this channel works the same way. Public filings, court records, internal disclosures, earnings call transcripts. Reassembled into the picture, these companies spend enormous resources hoping you never piece together on your own. Subscribe and you stop reacting to headlines about these companies. You start seeing the architecture underneath them before the headline even breaks. That isn't a courtesy. That is a competitive advantage that almost nobody bothers to claim. Now back to the toll booth nobody can see. To understand a toll booth that keeps 83 cents on every dollar without lending a single cent of it, you have to start with a grocer who got tired of being ignored. In 1904, a former produce merchant named Amadeo Giannini opened a small bank in San Francisco's North Beach neighborhood. He called it the Bank of Italy. At the time, the East Coast financial establishment, the JP Morgans, the Mellons, the institutions that had been built for old money and older families, treated immigrant laborers as a credit risk, not worth the paperwork. They lent to industrialists and landowners. They did not lend to dock workers and fruit peddlers. Giannini built his entire business model on precisely those customers, the ones everyone else refused. He gave mortgages to Italian immigrants being actively discriminated against by established lenders, auto loans to grocers who'd never been inside a bank, savings accounts to families the mainstream financial industry openly categorized as financial risks beneath their consideration. He called his vision a financial supermarket, one institution offering everyday people the same mortgages, insurance, investment access, and checking accounts that had previously been restricted to the wealthy as a matter of unspoken policy. It worked far beyond what anyone expected. By the late 1920s, Giannini's bank held more than $1 billion in assets. It had a new name, Bank of America, and it had proven something the rest of the industry would spend decades trying to replicate: that the middle class was a more scalable engine for financial growth than the elite had ever been. That founding philosophy, chase volume at the bottom of the market, not exclusivity at the top, never fully left the company's institutional memory. And 7 decades later, it would resurface as a payment network that charged a fraction of a cent per transaction on billions of transactions a day across every demographic on Earth. Giannini didn't build Visa, but he built the institutional appetite for mass market scale that Visa would eventually transform into something its founder never imagined. The credit card as we know it today nearly died in its own birth year. In September 1958, under Bank President S. Clark Baisey, a Bank of America manager named Joseph Williams ran one of the most reckless financial experiments in American history. He mailed 60,000 unsolicited credit cards to nearly every household in Fresno, California. No applications, no credit checks, no income verification of any kind. Just a card, a $300 limit, and an 18% interest rate dropped through the mail slot of an entire mid-sized city at once. Williams projected a 4% delinquency rate. What he got was 20. Criminals immediately recognized the opportunity. They intercepted mail, they forged signatures, they activated cards that had been assigned to people who never asked for them. Banks cashed out limits against accounts that barely existed. The entire operation descended into a documented disaster. Bank of America hemorrhaged $8.8 million in the first months of the program, a figure that today would represent tens of millions in real purchasing power. And Williams was terminated before the calendar turned to 1959. History remembered the Fresno drop for a long time as a cautionary tale about moving faster than a market could absorb. What it actually proved, buried underneath the fraud and the dismissal, was something nobody in banking had ever tested so directly. Ordinary people wanted instant, unsecured credit more badly than the financial industry had ever assumed. The demand wasn't a business school theory. It was documented fact disguised as a disaster. And appetite, historically, tends to outlast the argument that caution wins. Here is the part that almost nobody outside of financial history circles has ever been taught. Bank of America didn't want to be in the transaction processing business forever. Running the back end for millions of small retail purchases wasn't the core competency of a commercial bank with far more profitable things to do with its capital. So it pivoted to something significantly more elegant. Rather than operating the card program directly, Bank of America would license the Bank Americard name and infrastructure to other banks. Those banks could issue cards under the Bank Americard brand for a licensing fee. Bank of America's network would handle the processing underneath. That single decision split the business model permanently in two. The issuing banks, not the network, would carry the credit risk, the loans, the missed payments, the collections, the defaults. The network itself would carry almost none of it. It would simply collect a toll every single time on every transaction that crossed its rails. A clean, predictable, growing revenue stream, structurally insulated from the volatility of actually lending money. Let that sit for a moment, because it is literally the genetic code of everything we've discussed in this video so far. The 83% margin, the zero risk, the invisibility of the fee inside the price of a box of cereal. None of that was engineered in a recent boardroom. It was written into a licensing decision in the late 1960s, before color television was common in most American living rooms. The architecture predates most of the people running the company today by 50 years, which is, in its own way, the most important fact about it. The man who took that licensing structure and scaled it into a global network wasn't a banker, and by his own description, he never wanted to be. His name was D. Hawk, a Mormon farm boy from rural Utah who had spent his career at minor banks in the Pacific Northwest, openly resenting hierarchical management and institutional rigidity. By the late 1960s, Bank Americard's licensing model was collapsing under its own weight. Fraud was rampant across member banks. The processing infrastructure couldn't handle the transaction volume. Bank of America handed Hawk the job of fixing the mess. He didn't respond by hiring more managers and building more process. He did something genuinely unusual for a corporate executive in the late 1960s. He looked at nature. There was no principal blackbird in a flock, Hawk said later. There was no president tree in the forest. And yet, Everything was competition and cooperation in nature. Hawke envisioned a system he eventually called chaotic, a portmanteau he invented himself, blending chaos and order. Thousands of independent banks would compete fiercely against each other for customers on interest rates, on rewards, on customer service, on everything within their own domain, while cooperating completely on a shared processing infrastructure underneath. No single bank in charge, no central command and control architecture. A distributed network of independent nodes held together by shared rules rather than shared ownership. It was, by Hawke's own stated intention, specifically designed to be impossible to monopolize. It didn't hold that principle intact for long. In 1971, NBI tried to enforce a rule prohibiting its member banks from simultaneously issuing cards from a rival network, the one that would later become Mastercard. Internally, it was called the anti-duality policy. Its entire logic was to lock banks into complete exclusive loyalty to one network. A bank that issued Bank Americard could not also issue a competing card. A regional bank named Worthen Bank took NBI to court on antitrust grounds. Worthen won. The federal ruling forced NBI to tear the anti-duality policy down entirely. Banks could now issue both competing cards simultaneously. It was the first time a court ever found that this network's rules for defeating competition had crossed a legal line. D. Hawk reportedly received personal threats over the resolution. He pressed forward anyway, and in the mid 1970s, with the network now spanning multiple continents and processing tens of billions in annual transactions, Hawke recognized that Bank Americard was an American name attached to a global ambition. He ran a worldwide search for a replacement, a word that worked in every language, a word that suggested universal access and universal acceptance. He chose Visa. Here is the specific innovation that separated this network from every competitor trying to follow it, and it almost never gets mentioned in the standard history. In the early 1970s, processing a credit card transaction still relied on a paper process that was dangerously vague by modern standards. A merchant would call a phone bank, read out the card number to a human operator, and wait. The human checked a printed list of stolen or over-limit accounts, a negative file that was updated infrequently and mailed to merchants in physical booklets. The entire authorization process depended on a person, a phone, a booklet, and the assumption that neither the card nor the account information had been compromised. Fraud ran unchecked through the gaps between those updates. DeHawk's team built what they called Base 1, the first proprietary, fully electronic authorization system in the payment card industry. For the first time, authorization moved from paper books and phone operators to a digital, real-time query and response system. A merchant's terminal connected directly to the network. The network checked the account status electronically. The answer came back before the customer had put the card back in their wallet. That technological leap created an asymmetry that protected Visa's market position for the next 2 decades. Any competitor trying to offer a rival card also needed to build that electronic authorization infrastructure, the data centers, the network connections, the proprietary protocols. Building it from scratch required capital and time that smaller competitors and new entrants almost never had. Visa had already spent it. The barrier wasn't the brand. The barrier was the technological infrastructure the brand ran on. This is the template that Visa would repeat 40 years later with tokenization. Build the critical infrastructure layer first. Make it indispensable to the ecosystem. Then ensure that every alternative that enters the market has to interface with that infrastructure rather than bypass it. By the early 1980s, that name was on cards generating $59 billion in annual billings, controlling roughly 60% of the US card market. DeHawk had built the most dominant payment network in the world, designed specifically to prevent concentrated control. What happened to that design next is the story of how a good idea, scaled past a certain threshold, tends to become something its creator never intended. Once the Visa brand landed, growth stopped being gradual. It compounded. But the compounding had a specific mechanical driver that most observers miss entirely: Visa's dominance didn't come primarily from marketing budgets or consumer advertising, though Visa spent heavily on both, most famously through its long-running Olympic sponsorship, which began in 1986 and has extended continuously since. The real driver of dominance was a structural trap built into the nature of the two-sided network itself. For a bank to issue a card, it needs a network that merchants accept. For a merchant to accept a card, it needs that network to already be in every customer's wallet. Visa got there first, at scale, on both sides simultaneously. And the moment that equilibrium locked in, it became almost physically impossible for a new competitor to break it. An entrant trying to challenge Visa in the 1990s would have faced this exact problem: convince millions of consumers to carry a card that no store accepts, while simultaneously convincing millions of stores to buy new hardware for a card no consumer carries. You need both sides to move at once, against an incumbent that has already won both sides. Economists call it the chicken and egg problem of two-sided markets. In practice, it functions like an economic moat that's also a fortress wall. The network survived challenges to that dominance for 30 consecutive years through a pattern that, in retrospect, tells you more about the structure of the business than any earnings call ever could. In the 1990s, Phil Purcell, the executive behind what became the Discover card, joined forces with American Express to file federal complaints alleging that Visa and Mastercard were conspiring to lock rival networks out of bank issuing relationships. The antitrust scrutiny was real, the litigation was expensive, and the outcome forced some changes. None of them disrupted Visa's core trajectory. In the early 2000s, Walmart led a sweeping class action against Visa over the mechanics of debit card acceptance. Merchants had been forced, under Visa's honor all cards rule, to accept Visa debit under the same terms as credit, a rule that effectively prevented them from routing to cheaper alternatives. The eventual settlement, when combined with related Mastercard cases, represented one of the largest antitrust recoveries in American history at that point. Visa paid. Then it kept growing. Each fight cost real money. Not one of them slowed the network for more than a quarter. The structural moat held through every impact because the settlement money came from revenue, and revenue was growing faster than the settlements. This is the first detail almost nobody has been told about how this company is actually built. Visa is not resilient because it wins fights. It is resilient because the cost of fighting it is lower than the cost of walking away from it. Every merchant that sues Visa and wins a settlement still has to accept Visa cards the next morning because their customers carry Visa. The network's value is greater than the merchant's grievance every single time. That's not a coincidence. That's the design. Now hold on, because this is where the story flips in a way most viewers never see. Every advantage we've just described, the unbreakable network effect, the structural immunity to settlement pressure, the ability to survive billion-dollar legal judgments and still grow 20% the following year. DeHawk spent his entire career arguing that no single entity should ever capture this system the way a government controls a country. He designed it to resist centralized power by distributing it across thousands of institutions. What the DOJ is now arguing in United States versus Visa is that the network Hawk built specifically to prevent monopoly has been maintained as one through exclusionary contracts, through financial penalties designed to make banks afraid to route transactions elsewhere, and through deliberate strategic decisions to co-opt or neutralize any technology that threatened to bypass the rails. The irony is not incidental, it is the entire story. The 2008 IPO changed the institutional identity of this company in ways that are still working their way through the system today. Before 2008, Visa was owned by its member banks, a cooperative structure with no public shareholders and no quarterly earnings pressure. When it went public, it raised roughly $17.9 billion in its initial offering, the largest IPO in US history at the time. The structure changed overnight, from a member-owned cooperative with diffuse accountability to a publicly traded corporation with a single concentrated objective: returning capital to shareholders every quarter indefinitely. That transition from cooperative to corporation matters because it changed the internal calculus on everything: on how aggressively to push interchange fees, on whether to let competitive alternatives develop on the network or acquire and neutralize them, on how much lobbying capital to deploy against fee regulation. The member banks that previously owned Visa had mixed interests. They competed with each other, and some wanted lower fees in some segments. The public company has one clear interest: earnings per share, quarter after quarter, and the buyback program that compounds it. Over the 10 years following the IPO, Visa repurchased tens of billions of dollars of its own stock, quietly concentrating equity ownership among institutional holders while systematically reducing the share count that each dollar of earnings was divided across. The math is elegant and invisible to most retail investors. The revenue doesn't have to grow as fast if the denominator is shrinking at the same time. Then, in 2016, Visa made its largest single deal. It acquired Visa Europe, previously a separate bank-owned entity, for approximately 21 billion euros. Here is the detail almost nobody outside corporate finance has ever seen. When Visa bought Visa Europe, the European banks that had previously owned it didn't just receive cash. They received specialized preferred stock, Class B and C shares, in the new combined entity, whose conversion terms were explicitly tied to the outcome of ongoing European litigation. European regulators and merchants had been suing Visa over interchange fees for years. The intercompany agreements embedded in the acquisition dictated that when Visa settled those lawsuits going forward, a portion of the cost would be absorbed by the European banks holding that preferred stock through an adjustment in the conversion ratios. The US parent company built a legal liability shifting mechanism into the equity structure of its own acquisition. It's structured so that Visa Inc.'s shareholders in San Francisco don't fully bear the cost of Visa's European legal exposure, the European banks that used to own the business too, through their preferred stock positions. It is, without exaggeration, one of the most sophisticated pieces of corporate financial engineering in the payments industry in the last decade. And it is sitting in the footnotes of the annual report, waiting for someone to look for it. Here's the third detail almost nobody outside the payments industry has ever encountered. By the time most consumers think they've opted out of Visa by paying through a digital wallet, they often haven't. When Apple Pay and Google Pay launched, a common narrative emerged that these products would eventually disintermediate traditional card networks, that big tech would own the consumer relationship, control the data, and eventually bypass Visa entirely. Visa saw this coming before almost anyone else. Rather than treating digital wallets as a threat, it built the Visa Token Service, VTS, and negotiated it into the core architecture of every major digital wallet before they launched at scale. VTS replaces your static 16-digit card number with a unique, dynamically generated token for every digital transaction. That technology is now embedded in Apple Pay, Google Pay, and most major e-commerce checkout vaults. When you tap your phone to pay, the merchant never sees your actual card number. They see a token. But generating that token, validating it, and settling the transaction underneath still routes through Visa's infrastructure. The consumer experience is tap, done, fast, modern. The underlying transaction is Visa still taking the toll. The wallet changed, the rail didn't. Here's the answer to the question from the opening, the one about zero risk and 83% margins. The mechanism is sitting in Visa's own public filings, in a single line item that most investors scroll past without reading. It's labeled Client Incentives. In fiscal year 2023, Visa's gross revenue was $44.5 billion. The net revenue reported to the public was $32.6 billion. The gap, nearly $12 billion, went back out the door to the banks and partners that issue Visa cards and route volume through the network. In fiscal 2025, that number had climbed to approximately $15.75 billion in a single year, paid back to JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, the largest financial institutions in the United States, receiving annual rebates from a company that depends on them to stay loyal rather than switching their card portfolios to Mastercard. Here is where the accounting classification matters enormously. Those billions of dollars are booked as contra revenue, a subtraction from gross revenue before Visa ever calculates its operating margin. If that same amount were recorded as a marketing and customer retention expense, which is, by any plain English description, exactly what it is, Visa's reported operating margin would drop from roughly 67% to somewhere closer to 45%. The economic reality of the business doesn't change. The number the financial press reports every quarter does. So where does the money for 12 to 15 billion dollars in annual bank rebates actually come from? The answer is interchange fees, and following that, money reveals a wealth transfer mechanism that sits invisibly underneath every retail transaction in America. Every time you use a credit card at a merchant, that merchant pays an interchange fee, a percentage of the transaction amount that is set by Visa but flows to the bank that issued your card. Visa takes a separate, thinner processing cut on top. The interchange fee ranges from roughly 1% for basic debit cards to over 3% for ultra premium rewards cards like Visa Infinite. The higher the reward tier of the card, the higher the interchange fee the merchant pays. Merchants don't eat that cost. They build it into the price of what they sell. So, the shelf price of a product reflects some proportion of the interchange cost of the mix of cards accepted at that register. Every customer in the store, including the person paying in cash, including the person using a basic debit card, pays that embedded cost. But the rewards funded by the interchange on premium cards flow only to the cardholders who carry those premium cards, which are disproportionately higher income consumers. This is a documented regressive subsidy embedded in the price of everyday goods. The Congressional Budget Office and multiple academic economists have written about it. It sits at the center of the political coalition behind the Credit Card Competition Act, and it is almost never explained in plain terms in the financial press, because the financial press is largely funded by the financial services industry. Now follow the money one more level out into Washington, because the machine has a political defense system as sophisticated as its financial architecture. The single largest legislative threat to this structure right now is the Credit Card Competition Act, backed by a bipartisan coalition that includes both Democratic and Republican senators. The bill would require large banks to include at least one credit card network other than Visa or Mastercard on every credit card they issue. It's essentially the same requirement that the Durbin Amendment applied to debit cards in 2010. Visa doesn't fight this bill under its own name in most of the public-facing debate. It funds trade organizations, most prominently the Electronic Payments Coalition, which run advertising campaigns, hire lobbying firms. Then, in March of 2026, pressure arrived from a direction nobody in the industry had anticipated. The Federal Trade Commission sent formal warning letters to the CEOs of Visa, Mastercard, PayPal, and Stripe. FTC Chairman Andrew Ferguson's letters warned that any act to deplatform customers or deny them access to financial products or services based on political or religious beliefs could constitute a violation of the FTC Act. The letters to Visa and Mastercard were specifically pointed. They warned that the networks must not only avoid such conduct themselves, but that they must not turn a blind eye when their member banks engaged in it. FTC Warning Letters, March 26, 2026. Equally concerning is the conduct of payments providers and payment networks that turn a blind eye when their financial institution members debank consumers for these reasons. A payment network, the infrastructure underneath modern American commerce, was placed on formal federal notice that its role as a financial gatekeeper carries obligations that extend beyond the transaction itself. The debate over what those obligations should be is genuinely contested. What isn't contested is what it signals: that regulators increasingly view Visa not just as a payment processor, but as a piece of essential public infrastructure. One whose gatekeeping decisions carry the weight of rights, not just contracts. Let's go back inside the books for a moment, because there's a layer of tax architecture underneath the revenue architecture that is equally invisible to the public. Visa's US statutory tax rate is 21%. Its actual effective tax rate routinely lands somewhere between 16 and 17%. That gap is created through a mechanism most people have heard described in abstract terms: offshore IP routing, but almost never explained in the specific way it applies here. When a transaction occurs in Germany, the fee doesn't immediately flow back to Visa's San Francisco headquarters and get taxed as US income. It's captured first by Visa Europe subsidiaries, which then pay a royalty back to the parent company for the use of Visa's technology and intellectual property. It is entirely legal. The deductions exist because Congress wrote them. And the result is a company that processes trillions of dollars in global transactions every year while paying an effective tax rate roughly 4 points below the statutory rate. And then there is the episode Visa would prefer stayed in the footnotes. Between 2014 and 2019, Visa continued processing payments for MindGeek, the parent company of Pornhub, despite years of documented public complaints, elevated chargeback rates, and active law enforcement subpoenas connected to non-consensual and child sexual abuse content on the platform. Payment networks have deep systematic visibility into merchant risk signals. Chargeback rates above industry thresholds trigger compliance reviews. These were not quiet indicators. They were documented, repeated, and in the public record. On December 4th, 2020, the New York Times published a column by Nicholas Kristof directly naming Visa and Mastercard as financial enablers of the platform's ecosystem. 6 days later, not 6 months, not 6 weeks, Visa announced it was severing ties with MindGeek entirely. The timeline is the story. The action that couldn't happen during 5 years of documented harm happened in 6 days once the damage threatened the stock price. Critics have noted consistently that the moral threshold appears to be set not by internal ethics review but by external media pressure. Before we close this section, there is one mechanism the research community calls the single greatest structural threat to this company's long-term future. It comes from the US Federal Reserve. In 2023, the Federal Reserve launched FedNow, a real-time interbank settlement network that allows money to move between US bank accounts in seconds around the clock. Most consumers have never heard of it, but consider what already exists in India and Brazil. UPI launched in 2016. By 2022, it was processing more digital transactions than Visa in India entirely. The same pattern played out in Brazil with Pix. The timeline from government infrastructure product to consumer payments application displacing card networks has been demonstrated twice in the last decade in two of the world's largest economies. If a consortium of major US retailers, Amazon, Walmart, Target, funds the development of a consumer-facing pay-by-bank wallet built on FedNow's instant settlement rails, a meaningful portion of US debit volume could migrate within 36 months. Merchants would actively steer customers toward it. Consumers would rationally adopt it. The question is not theoretical. It is a matter of timing. So here is loop 1, fully closed, zero risk, 83% margin. The answer is accounting structure that reclassifies a marketing expense funded by an interchange architecture that redistributes wealth upward, defended by a lobbying machine that frames the reform as a threat to ordinary consumers. None of it is illegal. All of it is disclosed. Almost none of it is explained in plain language, by design. Which brings us to the question, if this machine is engineered this carefully, why is the federal government inside a courtroom right now trying to dismantle it? And what actually happens if they win? On September 24, 2024, the United States Department of Justice filed a civil antitrust lawsuit in the Southern District of New York, accusing Visa of illegally monopolizing the American debit card market, not competing aggressively, not bending around the edges of regulation, monopolizing. In violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act, the complaint cited Visa's own internal documents. Executives had described emerging fintech platforms, particularly Plaid, as an existential threat to the debit routing business. The DOJ alleged that Visa's response to that threat wasn't to outbuild the competition, it was to acquire it and neutralize it before it could erode margins. In 2020, Visa announced a $5.3 billion acquisition of Plaid. Former CEO Al Kelly described the deal internally as an insurance policy against the debit disruption Plaid represented. The DOJ sued to block it on antitrust grounds. Visa abandoned the deal in early 2021 rather than fight through a full trial. 4 years later, the DOJ returned with a broader complaint. alleging that the Plaid attempt was not an isolated decision, but a symptom of a systematic strategy to co-opt or financially penalize any entity that attempted to route debit transactions away from Visa's network. The complaint included internal CFO statements characterizing the competitive landscape in terms that the government described as revealing a deliberate posture of aggressive market maintenance. On June 23, 2025, Federal Judge John Courtel denied Visa's motion to dismiss. The case proceeds. No trial date has been set as of mid 2026, but the DOJ has consistently pushed for expedited discovery, framing the case, in its own words, as one being pursued on behalf of the American people with a sovereign interest in moving forward quickly. If the government ultimately prevails, it could force Visa to restructure the exclusionary routing contracts and cliff pricing incentive agreements that currently keep banks and merchants locked into its debit network. At 83% North American operating margins on debit, a ruling that forces true competition into that market would compress those margins in ways the company has never had to manage before. Here's why the government is doing this now. Because internal documents unsealed in the case show a company that knew its debit dominance was structurally fragile, that the only alternatives genuinely capable of competing on price were being systematically kept off the field through financial incentives specifically designed to make choosing an alternative economically painful. That isn't the behavior of a company competing on merit. It's the behavior of a company that has evaluated its own position honestly and concluded the position cannot survive merit-based competition. The debit case isn't the only legal battleground. In June of 2026, just weeks before this video, US District Judge Brian Cogan in Brooklyn granted preliminary approval to a revised $38 billion settlement between Visa, Mastercard, and more than 12 million American merchants. The original case was filed in 2005, 21 years ago, alleging that Visa and Mastercard colluded with banks to fix interchange fees. The National Retail Federation stated publicly that the settlement still doesn't address the fundamental structure of the market. Final approval has not yet been granted. For context, Visa's net revenue in fiscal 2025 was $40 billion. The settlement figure represents nearly one complete year of total revenue. That's how large the accumulated damage had to become before a court considered the remedy adequate. The legal pressure is the headline. The competitive fragmentation is the more structurally important story. In Europe, Visa's share of transaction volume dropped from approximately 58% in 2020 to around 51% in 2026. 7 percentage points in 6 years, not to a new card competitor, but to Mastercard, which moved aggressively into digital bank relationships that Visa treated as secondary to its legacy banking partnerships. Mastercard signed preferred network agreements with Revolut, Monzo, and N26 during the period when EU open banking regulations were creating new market access for neobanks. Visa held its ground on pricing with traditional banks and watched those 7 points bleed away to a competitor that made a different tactical choice in a different moment. Visa European market share approximately 58% 2020 to approximately 51% 2026. Mastercard approximately 41% to approximately 47%. In Asia, the situation is more permanent. India's UPI, the Unified Payments Interface, a government-built, real-time, zero-fee account-to-account network, processed 228 billion transactions in 2025. That's 85% of all digital payment volume in a country of 1.4 billion people. Visa processed none of it. Brazil's Pix, a similar government initiative, handled 6 billion transactions per month by the same year. Projections put Pix at 58% of Brazilian e-commerce spend by 2028. Visa has no realistic path to competing with networks that charge zero and are mandated by the state. Then there is Capital One. In May 2025, the Capital One acquisition of Discover Financial closed, and with it, the third largest issuer of Visa credit cards in the United States became the owner of its own payment network. Capital One no longer has to pay Visa the network fee on its own card volume. It can route its own transactions across Discover rails, keep the margin itself. The migration will take years. Its direction is clear. On June 1st, 2018, Visa's European processing network suffered a catastrophic partial hardware failure, a switch fault, in one of its two primary European data centers. The failover systems failed to handle cleanly. Consumers were turned away at grocery stores. Some merchants had to post handwritten cash-only signs in 2018. The failure exposed that Visa's European infrastructure had become so complex that the team couldn't immediately determine whether to fail over entirely or patch on the fly. They hesitated. The network that processes a substantial fraction of global commerce had a single point of failure embedded in it that nobody caught until it failed publicly for 10 hours across the continent. Here is 2026 in plain numbers. Visa still controls more than 70% of US debit purchase volume. Its net margin sits above 50%. By any conventional metric, it is one of the most profitable businesses in the history of corporate America. And yet, the federal government is in a Manhattan courtroom. 7 points of European market share are gone. India and Brazil are operating entirely outside Visa's rails. The fortress is intact. The walls are thinner than they were 10 years ago, and the people building alternative foundations are no longer startups asking permission. Any honest analysis of this company has to start with what it has built that is genuinely exceptional. These aren't qualifications, they're facts with the same weight as the failures, and they require the same specificity. The first is infrastructure reliability at a scale that has almost no commercial parallel. VisaNet processes over 65,000 transaction messages per second during Black Friday, during Super Bowl Sunday, during the global surge that follows a catastrophic weather event, and a million simultaneous insurance claims. Competitors promising faster, cheaper alternatives, including several blockchain-based networks that attracted enormous investment capital in recent years, have experienced catastrophic outages trying to handle a fraction of that load. Visa's Ashburn, Virginia Operations Center is built with 18-inch concrete walls rated to handle 170 mile-per-hour winds, holding 100,000 gallons of on-site fuel for 5 days of autonomous generator power. This is engineered for the kind of uptime a physical bank vault is designed for. When it has failed, most significantly during a European data center switching failure in June 2018, that took down nearly 5 million transactions over 10 hours. The disruption made international headlines because the bar has been set so high that even a partial failure is news. The second is tokenization architecture. Visa Token Service didn't just improve payment security, it positioned Visa as the indispensable infrastructure layer inside digital wallets that many observers assumed would eventually displace it. When Apple Pay and Google Pay launched with the promise of replacing the card, Visa had already negotiated itself into the technical stack underneath both of them. The token is Visa, the wallet is Apple, the consumer sees Apple, Visa collects the toll, executed invisibly and brilliantly. The third is AI and fraud detection infrastructure that no competitor has come close to matching. Visa has built what it calls large transaction models, proprietary AI trained on decades of behavioral transaction data across every market, every currency, every purchase category at a scale that cannot be replicated by any entrant in any time frame under a decade. That dataset translates directly to lower false positive rates on fraud alerts, higher authorization rates on legitimate transactions, and less friction for cardholders and merchants alike. In a business where every rejected legitimate transaction is a lost sale for a merchant, fraud detection quality is a genuine competitive moat, not a marketing differentiator. Three structural problems sit underneath those strengths. They won't resolve themselves without deliberate action, and they are each directly traceable to decisions made during the company's rise. The first is the regressive architecture of interchange. The facts are as described. Cash and basic debit users pay the embedded cost of a fee structure whose rewards flow upward. That structure is now driving a congressional coalition with White House support behind legislation that would fundamentally change how credit card routing works. That dataset translates directly to lower false positive rates on fraud alerts. Waiting for that legislation to fail is a strategy with a worsening risk profile every session Congress convenes. Fraud detection quality is a genuine competitive moat, not a marketing differentiator. Two of the three largest payment growth markets in the coming decade are already operating outside Visa's rails. On terms Visa cannot match, zero fees, government mandate, and sovereign priority over any private network's claim. Three structural problems sit underneath those strengths, is intellectually sound and would be genuinely valuable if executed. It is also a complete pivot from the identity and business model Visa has optimized for 60 plus years. If the Credit Card Competition Act passes in its current form, the margin compression in US credit would be material and immediate. The second is strategic geography. The 2020 to 2023 window is closed. Mastercard used it, Visa didn't. Not because of a lack of resources, but because of a strategic judgment that the acquisition path was preferable to the build path, followed by 3 years of antitrust litigation that ended with neither option. That lag has compounded in European market share numbers that don't reverse easily. The company's stated response become the network of networks, connecting sovereign rails to each other. Pivots of that magnitude take longer and cost more than the plans presented to investors typically acknowledge. On interchange and regulation, move toward transparent tiered pricing before legislation forces it. Visa's historical argument that any pricing transparency requirement will destroy consumer rewards is losing traction in courts and in Congress. The third is the innovation sequencing failure in open banking is in a far more defensible position than one that defends opacity until a court orders it to stop. The rewards ecosystem survives some margin compression. It doesn't survive a legislature that stops believing it was ever the real concern. Once a digital bank has signed a preferred network agreement and treat it as the current operational priority, the Visa Direct platform exists and is growing. The B2B Connect infrastructure exists. What's missing is the urgency and the commercial framing to position Visa to UPI administrators and PIX operators as the natural partner for their cross-border ambitions, rather than as the incumbent their domestic success was specifically designed to defeat. What would a smarter version of this company do from this position, rather than issuing banks? And that relationship doesn't get built by the same team that has spent 20 years fighting interchange regulation. A company that proactively builds a consumer comprehensible pricing framework and publishes it voluntarily. Visa is actively patenting technology to embed credentials inside autonomous AI agents, software systems that can transact without human initiation. If commerce increasingly becomes AI to AI, the question of who verifies and settles those transactions becomes enormously valuable. Visa has the trust infrastructure and the fraud detection depth to lead that category. On geography, stop treating become the cross-border settlement layer for sovereign networks as a future aspiration. The positioning requires a different kind of relationship than Visa has typically built with regulators and central banks. The regressive fee structure can be reformed without destroying Visa. The Credit Card Competition Act, if passed, introduces price competition the same way Durbin introduced it on debit. Debit margins compressed. The company survived. Credit would be a larger compression event, but it doesn't make Visa non-viable. It accelerates the transition towards services revenue. On innovation, the agentic commerce opportunity is real and time sensitive. The DOJ case, if the government prevails, most likely produces behavioral remedies, modifications to the routing contracts and incentive structures that the complaint alleges are exclusionary rather than a structural breakup of the network. That's the historical pattern for Section 2 monopolization cases. Remedies constrain conduct. They rarely dismantle networks that carry this volume. Whether it moves at the speed the category requires is the empirical question that the next investor cycle will answer. The fact that Visa connects 15,000 financial institutions to 130 million merchant locations across more than 200 countries is not a legal construct that a court can dissolve. It is the accumulated result of 66 years of parallel adoption by both sides of the market. Can it be stopped? Here is the honest, specific answer. The realistic trajectory for Visa is not collapse but compression in specific categories over a specific timeline, driven by a combination of regulatory action, competitive alternatives, and sovereign infrastructure, fraud detection, tokenization, analytics that Visa is building toward anyway, rather than structural dominance, can sustain. What cannot be undone by any regulatory outcome is the network effect itself. When a business charges a fee that neither the buyer nor the seller ever sees itemized, a fee embedded invisibly inside the price of something else, it has achieved the most durable form of pricing power that exists: invisible pricing power. You cannot push back on a charge you have never been told you're paying. You cannot comparison shop a fee that looks like a rounding error inside the price of milk. No ruling will make those merchants stop accepting the cards their customers carry. The invisibility is not a flaw in the model. The invisibility is the product. Visa didn't reach 83% margins in North America by being the only option. It reached them by being the option most people never noticed they were paying for. That principle governs insurance float, software licensing, platform referral fees, currency exchange spreads, and dozens of other industries where the person bearing the cost and the person choosing the product are not the same person. The core machine keeps running. The margins on specific parts of it slowly compress toward the rates that competitive pressure. The answer to that question will explain almost everything else about the business you're analyzing. Here is what this video actually proved. Visa is not a payments company. It is a tax that learned to disguise itself as a convenience. And the deepest measure of how successful that disguise has been is this. Most people watching this documentary have paid it thousands of times across their entire lives without once knowing they were paying it at all. A man who despised hierarchy built a network specifically designed to prevent concentrated power. 70 years later, that network faces federal prosecution for exactly the kind of concentrated power its own architect spent his career trying to prevent. The machine didn't betray the design. It fulfilled it, all the way to the logical end that the design always made possible. Next on Strategy Lens, Goldman Sachs, a bank that advised both sides of a deal, collected fees from each of them, held securities that profited from the collapse, and walked away. A firm that has advised sovereign governments, restructured national debt, and paid more than $5 billion in combined fines across 2 continents for a single transaction, then returned to business the following Monday as if the conversation were finished. 2 questions before that video. How does a bank survive being caught in the middle of its own client's destruction? Not once, but repeatedly across decades. And what does it mean when the people responsible for regulating the world's most powerful financial institution spent their careers inside it first? Subscribe to Strategy Lens now, because the people these institutions pay to keep you from understanding them are already working. The toll booth has been collecting from you your entire life. The least you can do is finally know who owns it.